Hello, and welcome to the American Council on Exercise live webinars continuing education series. My name is Jackie Crockford, and I will be your host for today's live event. Before we get started with today's live course, let's go over a few logistics so that you can have a great learning experience. So on your screen now, you can see that you are watching today for free. So thank you for joining us via YouTube. If you take a look at your YouTube viewer, you should see a chat box, and you can feel free to use that chat box at any time throughout today's live event. You can type in questions for ACE. I'll be monitoring those throughout today's presentation, and you can type in questions for our presenter, and we will take those live at the end of today's webinar. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we will be talking a little bit more about how you can earn continuing education credits for today's event. Because you are watching today for free, no continuing education credits are awarded today, but you can earn those after purchasing the course once it is complete. And we'll talk more about that at the end of today's presentation. Okay, if you are ready for today's live course, let's get started. Welcome to your course, Exercise, Programming, Cardiorespiratory Training, and the ACE Integrated Fitness Training Model. My name is Jackie Crockford, and I will be your host for today's course. Joining me today is our presenter, Justin Robinson. Justin, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Awesome to be here today, live in the ACE studio. Excited, and I want to jump right into it. Quick disclaimer, actual work and some intensity. And then for performance, maybe this is where your athletes are. So specificity of training becomes very important, working towards a specific goal. But you can have goals, and they may be able to train for an event or race at any one of these phases. So let's have a little bit of background with programming, periodization, terminology. Before we get into that, I think it's very important to discuss why we program and discuss what we want to program. So when you're building rapport, one of the most important components of working with a client, you figure out why they were there. What are the goals? What are the intentions? Most of the time, their answers to why they hired you to coach or train them is they want to have fun and they want results. So we have this conflict at some point, or interaction rather, between enjoyment and results. And the conflict component comes from the fact that enjoyment, fun comes from variety, whereas results come from consistency of training. So doing the same workout week after week and having a progressive overload is a great way to get results, but is boring. Doing fun workouts and keeping everything different, every single training session different, is fun and exciting, but may not get you the results that you want. So there's this interplay between those two. And based on your client and based on where they're at in the training, there's, again, that interaction between those two. So just as base to fitness to performance is fluid, sometimes that interaction between a really fun workout and a really productive workout may be fluid as well. So as we're getting into the programming, here are the steps that I take through with my clients in my own training programs. And hopefully today I'll be able to interject some of the mistakes I've made as an athlete and some of the mistakes I've made as a coach. So sit down, set the goals, determine the duration of the training program. Most often, coaches will work backwards. You want to run a marathon. Okay, let's work back 18 weeks from there. Where are you today, and how do I get you to completing that marathon, either to just cross the finish line or for a very specific time. So we reverse engineer most of the time. So we set that. Now here's where things may differ from what you may be used to. The first thing I like to do, and what I was taught to do, is to insert the rest days rather than your key or intense workout days. And here's why. We don't want to add stress on top of stress. Everybody we're working with has a family, maybe has kids, has a job. There's pandemics, unfortunately, that add stress to our life. And so what we don't want to do is make an intense training day the same day as a high stress day. So we don't want to add training stress to life stress. So figure out what days, and we'll have an example of this, figure out what days are the lowest life stress days, if they exist, And maybe those are where we have the most intense training sessions. After we add in the rest and recovery, now we will add in those key workouts. And I suggest no more than 2 key workouts. By a key workout, I mean a high intense session or a session with long duration. And we typically want to keep those coming off of a rest or recovery day. An elite athlete can tolerate higher loads of training and higher intensities and can maybe have 3 or 4 intense training sessions per week. But the rest of us, 2 training sessions that are intense per week is probably the most that we can handle and sustain. From there, fill in the gaps. So look at what's already on that piece of paper or in this spreadsheet, and let's plug in maybe what is missing. Either what is important to that specific client or strength training, mobility training, maybe whatever they need. If they need some extra cardiorespiratory fitness, we'll plug in those gaps. And most importantly, build in flexibility. And by doing that, we're avoiding rigidity. We're avoiding direct, linear programs that are set in stone. A very rigid program that you hand to a client is awesome for about 3 weeks. And then life happens, and injuries happen, and it falls apart. So there's this concept of design thinking, and we can spend much more than an hour talking about design thinking and how it applies to business and marketing and teaching and education, military, but I can't do it justice in that amount of time. So what I can say in a very short period of time is that design thinking is iterative thinking, meaning that you plan for A to happen, but you also plan for B and for C to happen as well. And it's looped learning, it's looped teaching, it's looped programming. You may have heard, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. With design thinking, I kind of reverse that quote and saying, well, unless you're planning to fail, then you are failing to plan. So with design thinking, with this flexibility of a program, we want to plan for failure. And then we want to have a contingency plan for those failures. Now, when you're discussing with a client, you maybe don't use that word failure with skipping a workout, but we should plan to skip workouts. We should plan for injuries to happen. And so that way we'll reduce the need to catch up at some point because we don't have to take off 2 weeks completely and then try to jam those 2 weeks into the sequential 2 weeks when the client is healthy again. So plan for flexibility, plan for worst case scenarios, and program that mobility into the training. So our first training tip here for base fitness training. You may work with a lot of different types of clients, competitive and non-competitive athletes. Non-competitive athletes may be starting off in that base phase. A competitive athlete may be coming back to that base training phase in the off season, for example. So my quick tip here is that for the non-competitive athletes, go with what they enjoy. Program activities that are familiar and enjoyable. For a dancer, maybe somebody who danced previously, they may enjoy yoga. They may enjoy group-based training sessions. They may enjoy video-based sessions. Someone who is a former wrestler, knowing that mentality, they may enjoy hiking, backpacking, trail running. And so just figure out their personalities and again, try to associate activity with being positive. Elite athletes or competitive athletes, however, it's the opposite. What we want to do is train their weaknesses, figure out the weak links in the train, and program more of those into their training session. So it's probably something they don't enjoy, but if they're a competitive athlete, they understand that not liking a workout just kind of goes with the territory. So an example of that would be a high school cross-country runner. If you're working with a high school cross-country runner, they probably don't need more running. They probably don't need more conditioning or fitness. They probably need more strength training and more mobility. So that's a consideration. With triathletes, somebody like myself who participates in triathlon, I love running. I'm a decent runner, but I'm a terrible swimmer. So if it was up to me, I would run 4 days a week, and maybe swim 1 day a week. But objectively, as a coach working with my own program or somebody like myself, I would probably program 3 run sessions and 3 swim sessions. Again, focusing on those weaknesses and incorporating what they don't receive in their actual practice. Getting some overview of the terminology here, terms you've probably heard before, and again, pulling from some of the strength conditioning research. So our macro cycle, whether we're planning a strength training program, a combined program, or cardiorespiratory program, is the overall approach. And so this is something that's probably somewhere from a few months, maybe all the way up to 4 years for an Olympic training macro cycle. A mesocycle is a subset of that, and there are 3 to 5 mesocycles per macro cycle, and those are anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks each. A microcycle, same thing, there are typically 3 to 5 microcycles per mesocycle, and those are anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. A linear training program will have an increase of intensity with a subsequent decrease in training volume as you get closer to your event. Nonlinear has more fluctuations of those training intensities and training volumes. Undulating periodization is another term for nonlinear. And that's really what I recommend, is a nonlinear approach to your cardiorespiratory training program. I don't know too many coaches who use linear nowadays. Again, it's too rigid. It may be appropriate for a particular mesocycle, so maybe a very short training program, 3, maybe up to 6 weeks of linear. But if we're looking at how to keep people fit and healthy, and most importantly, engaged in their training over the course of a year, nonlinear is the way to go. Here are a few examples of block periodization, of these concepts. Greg Half and colleagues has done quite a bit of research in these areas. So the idea of block periodization is that you have one emphasis and you utilize the training adaptations from that to transfer over to the next training block. So if I was putting together a strength conditioning program, to use that as an example, rather than base, fitness, and performance, maybe I have strength, hypertrophy, and power, that I'm focusing on strength training for 6 or 8 weeks, and then I'm moving on to hypertrophy training for a period of time, and then I'm moving on to powerful explosive training. So that's how we would describe the sequential of lower intensity to moderate intensity to interval higher intensity, again for one mesocycle per block. The parallel concept would be, well, I'm going to work on all 3 things at the same time. So this is maybe 3 training sessions within the course of a week. So this is a more of an advanced technique and maybe more of a maintenance-based type of technique or concept. So maybe, again, 3 training sessions per week. I have a strength, a power, and a hypertrophy session, or I have a low, a moderate, and a high-intensity training session over the course of the week. The emphasis, this is what I would use for maybe more of an in-season athlete workout. Again, maybe more maintenance, or for somebody who has a very high training age. And that's where you have a really emphasis on one training component, but you still incorporate aspects of others. So the possibilities are really endless with these and how long you would spend in each block, and maybe you would use all 3 over the course of a year. So just trying to introduce some concepts, get the mind thinking that there's not just one way to program, and there's not just one way to plan periodization for either muscular or cardiorespiratory training. All right, let's start to put this together and discuss how we will actually plan and get ink to paper. So training zone, heart rate zones would be, and that's described in the ACE Personal Training Manual. I'm a big fan of field tests because field testing is incorporated into the workouts. Again, I love testing, I love data, but I hate taking away training sessions just to crunch some numbers. So I like incorporating my testing into the training. So an example of that would be a run time trial. So maybe you have a 5-mile run planned for your client for the weekend. Have them warm up for a mile, run the center section of that at the center 3.1 miles of 5K at just below race pace intensity, and then have them cool down. So sort of a run sandwich there with a mile warm up and a mile cool down. So with any of these, whether it's cycling, average wattage over maybe 20 or 30 kilometers, a 400 meter, 800 meter time trial in the pool, I suggest going at about 85 to 90% effort because chances are they're not tapered or rested in the same way that they would be on race day. So we can't expect race day intensities. So just one notch below race day, call it threshold training, call it 85, 90% of max, whatever makes sense to you and your client, and incorporate those field tests. It allows some autonomy and, again, kind of gets you out of the lab. Our programming example for fitness. So once again, we've assessed the client, and now we're getting that ink to paper. As I said, the first step is to incorporate the rest and recovery days. So maybe Monday is the day where they have to take the kids to school and pick them up. Maybe Thursday is a day where they have all sorts of meetings at work and they don't have a lot of time to train. All right, well, Monday, that's your rest day. On Thursday, hey, get home, let's just do a quick 30-minute preset yoga session or yoga video. And from there, our next step would be to add our key workouts. Again, the high intensity days or the longer duration days, no more than 2, and typically planning those coming off of a recovery or rebound day, if you like that term. So in this case, we'll have a high intensity training session, interval session on Tuesday, and then maybe Friday is a day where they get off work a little bit early, so we'll program a longer, low to moderate training zone run cycle. From here, we'll start to plug in the gaps, and maybe they're missing out, I would say so far, maybe missing out on some resistance training, so we'll incorporate that on a one-on-one personal training session, and then maybe a prescribed 30-minute session on the weekend. So what's nice about having that midweek one-on-one session for the personal trainers out there is you can use that design thinking. You can have an A, a B, and a C workout planned and figure out what has gone well and what their readiness to train is from previously in the week. So for example, if you prescribed a high-intensity interval training session on Tuesday and they crushed it, all right, they come in Wednesday morning and all right, we're gonna do more mobility today. We're gonna take longer rest in between our sets of strength training. If Tuesday got all hectic and 40 minutes turned into 20, okay, then let's do this. Let's incorporate some more metabolic conditioning exercises into our training session here on Wednesday. So we have flexibility over the course of the week, and that also suggests that we should have flexibility for that one-on-one session or even sessions within a particular day. And that would be the last part, is seeing what workouts over the course of the week are swappable. I don't know if that's a real word. I like the term swappable. But on this, I would say that Saturday and Sunday are very easy to be swapped. Monday and Thursday are very easy to be swapped. Again, Wednesday has flexibility built into there. So again, plan to fail, plan for workouts to be missed, plan ahead that injuries are going to happen, and iterate to your clients that some training is better than none. I always say 20 minutes is better than 0 minutes. So if I have you plan for an hour hike on Saturday and all you could do is walk the dog around the block for 20 minutes, great. We still accomplished something and we don't have to play catch up. Our fitness training tip for fitness component. So now maybe you have a client who is moving beyond the base and wants to start incorporating more interval training, maybe wants to start using some heart rate data, so or working for multiple different types of events, and wants to do strength training and the cardiorespiratory training. So what is this concept of concurrent training? Concurrent training means that you're doing more than one type of activity over the course of a week, possibly on a day. And it's great to have variety. I firmly believe we need to do cardio, mobility, and resistance training, but they can conflict with one another. So from a long-term standpoint, someone cannot have maximal strength gains and also maximal aerobic fitness gains. What I mean by that is if you are training somebody to be a power lifter, meaning that they lift heavy weights for one repetition, programming in 10-mile runs is going to be a detriment to their maximal strength. Likewise, ultra-endurance runners need to conduct strength training but ultra heavy training multiple days per week is going to pull away from their maximal aerobic capacity. Even within the course of a day, one training session may negatively influence another. If I do a heavy resistance training session and then try to run, my running fitness will suffer. So how we get around that, number one is we have specific training goals for long term. If the training goal is just to be fit and well and healthy, then great, concurrent training over the course of a year planning would be perfect. 4 to 6 hours is enough time in between same day training sessions to get rid of the negating effect of one session influencing another. So keep the client's goals in mind, program to their goals, and then 4 to 6 hours between training sessions is enough so that they don't influence each other. All right, so now we've worked with some clients and they're getting more fit. How do we continue to challenge, and how do we continue to get them to be even more fit? So when we're programming, think about what's called the 80-20 rule. And another descriptor of this is polarized training module. Now, the 80-20 rule can be applied to multiple aspects of life. You may have heard me talk about it in terms of nutrition in the past, but this polarized training model means that we're spending roughly 80% of the time in low and moderate heart rate zones, and then only 20% of the time in higher intensity, elevated heart rate training zones. And we'll get into a few examples of that. The 10% rule. So those of you who've done any marathon training may have heard of this, and it's the rule that you should only increase your volume by 10% each week. And I feel that this rule has limited applications. It's appropriate in very linear programs, and I've already told you I'm not a huge fan of direct, rigid linear programs, and it does have application for beginners, maybe in that base training phase. But what we see with nonlinear is that we'll progress for a few weeks in a row and then come back down. I refer to that as load, load, unload for each week or maybe each micro cycle. And so what we may see is jumps in training volume that exceed 10%, maybe even go up to as high as 30% from one week to the next. But then we'll see a 0% increase on that third week, or maybe even a decrease. So 10% maybe is an average over the course of a training program as far as increasing training volume, but it's not a hard set rule. So when we're programming, now we have, again, inks on paper, we have our overall plan. Let's start looking into individual workouts and how we can prescribe intensity within those workouts. So there's a few different ways to go about that. You can use heart rate. You can use RPE, rating of perceived exertion. You can also use your own, what I call relative intensity terms. And the ones you see on the screen there are my own terms, just from years of coaching and talking with other coaches, but these terms would be very similar to what a lot of other coaches may use. And as I already said, heart rate and RPE, and as we'll see on a few slides, and VT and LT all correlate very well. So once again, use what you have. Use what is comfortable and consistent with your clients. Here's the same information, but now we're matching it to energy systems. So the lower training zones, 1, 2, and 3, are where we're in more of the aerobic fitness system. So aerobic, carb, fat, protein, contributing to ATP production. Zones 4, zones 5, now we're dipping into anaerobic, so glycolytic and phosphagen systems. So again, just an overview of how I would use these terms, and a chart very similar to this is what I would give my clients on that first day, go through it with them, figure out what makes the most sense to them. However, using 5 zones is more of an advanced technique, and again would be for somebody with a higher training age who knows their own gears, knows their own training zones relatively well. A simplified approach would be taking those 5 zones down to 3. So heart rate zones 1, 2, and 3, zone 1 being below VT1, zone 2 being between VT1 and VT2, and then zone 2 being the higher intensity beyond ventilatory threshold 2. And the terminology here, the description, I use the term steady state or endurance. I don't like the word easy, so it's not easy training, it's steady state training. It's training that a client can perform for a relatively long period of time, maybe even 2 or 3 hours. The tempo training, one's ability to be in that zone is much shorter. And when we're near max or maximal training, that's very short, probably under a minute that we can stay in that maximal effort zone. And an easier way to describe these, or what makes sense, is the talk test. So I already mentioned the submaximal talk test, but for example, if you are walking, jogging with your client, maybe they're on a treadmill, maybe you're riding bikes together, and you can have a very easy conversation, full sentences, no discomfort with talking, that's zone 1. That's below VT1. At ventilatory threshold 1, our heart rate and our breathing rate start to change. There's a little inflection in the line. And so now we're maybe 3 or 4 words at a time, or there's some mild discomfort with saying those words. And then when we get to VT2, now it's head shakes and head nods. It's 1 or 2 word answers. It's definitely discomfort with being able to talk. So you can't stay in that zone for very long. This is a chart also from the ACE Personal Training Manual, just describing how long we can stay in those energy systems and the required rest or the suggested rest for intervals. Now, those of you who've been through exercise physiology in school know that it's very easy on paper, that when we start exercising, we go into the phosphagen, aka creatine phosphate system. And then we switch into the glycolytic system. And then we switch into aerobic metabolism. But it's not that clear cut. We do use different energy systems during physical activity, and there is a little bit of a flux from one to the next. If I'm on a bike ride, that's mostly aerobic. I hit a hill climb for 60 seconds, I dip into anaerobic, and then I kind of shift back to aerobic. So the higher the intensity, the longer the relative rest may be. As you can see that with a high intense phosphagen, creatine-based energy system under 10 seconds, you may need as much as a minute of rest. Looking at these same zones and looking at rest, that's one way I like to prescribe and monitor fitness gains. So for example, and we'll talk about this as well, I can make a session more difficult, I can make a session longer, or I can make a session more difficult by decreasing the rest in between interval sets. And I really like that. It's a great way to monitor fitness and a great way to program fitness. So one example of that may be when you're in your base training phase, you have a 2-to-1 rest to work ratio for your intervals. When you move on to the fitness base, maybe now you have a 1-to-1 rest to work ratio. And when you're moving on to performance, as many athletes compete in high-intensity interval-based sports, maybe now we're 2-to-1 the other way. We have a 2-to-1 work to rest ratio, a Tabata-style type of interval. So feel free to play around with the variables. And again, this is just my suggestion. I really like to decrease the rest. It's a great way to tell that your client is responding and adapting to the positive stresses of your activity sessions. Looking at some research here, again, describing that 80-20 rule, the polarized training model. The 80-20 rule would be that 80% of the training is completed below VT2 or LT2, and only about 20% of the training is planned for beyond that. As you can see with this curve somewhat mirrors what happens with lactate, in that lactate doesn't really change below VT1. Lactate is kind of coming and going at the same rate in between VT1 and 2, and then at VT2 or LT2, lactate exponentially increases, and we know that fatigue is coming. We're not going to be able to stay in that zone for very long. So that's why the work is typically very short, and then we rest and get ready for the next one. And what I will mention about this particular study is that it was an observational study. It was not an intervention. So this is just plotted data from what elite athletes did, how they actually trained. Same research group, as well as some compounded data looking at elite marathon runners and how they actually prepared and trained for their races. And you can see that this matches that same reverse J-shaped curve of where the vast majority of training was done at relatively low exercise intensities, and only a relative small portion was conducted at high heart rate intensities. And once again, RPE and heart rate, in this case, correlate very well with each other. So if you don't have a heart rate monitor, that doesn't mean you can't program cardiorespiratory training with your clients. Now, left under their own accord, most athletes will probably go the other way. They'll probably train in more of a bell-shaped curve, where you tell them to go light, and they'll probably go a little bit harder than they should. You tell them to go hard, and they probably won't go quite as hard as is prescribed. And they'll do more threshold type of training. That can still increase fitness, but it also maybe overstimulates sympathetic drive. And so I want to talk a lot today about active recovery, adequate recovery. And so training too much at threshold is maybe too much sympathetic nervous system stress and doesn't allow for proper recovery from one training session to the next. A good way to summarize that, a colleague of mine here has a quote of keeping your easy days easy and keeping your hard days hard. And I'll reframe this a little bit, and I say, keep your easy days easy so that your hard days can be hard. Go all out on the days that are supposed to be like that, and then train lighter, train more moderately on the days that are not supposed to be. And I think with our clients and figure out a lot of that. So again, use it to make your programming more intelligent, but don't treat any data from a lab test or wearable or tracker as doctrine. So we've talked about some training zones, a few examples. So here is real-life client data. Excuse me. So high-intensity training day, a HIIT workout. This was 10 rounds, so 10 minutes total on the Airdyne. And I originally programmed it for 30 seconds of all-out work with 30 seconds of rest. And you could see the information on there. And I think this was a moment of two things. One, I started noticing that the client was pacing himself in those 30 seconds, and that's not really what wasn't my intention. So in going back and kind of checking myself and rereading some of the research, I'm like, well, I'm kind of in between energy systems here. It's not quite phosphagen, it's not quite glycolytic. So what if we did this? What if I took that 30-30 down to 20-40? So decrease the work and increase the rest, but still had 10 rounds. So it's still 10 minutes of total work. But in that 20 seconds, I want an all-out effort. No pacing, go hard. And the average watts increased. The total distance stayed the same. The RPE went from, man, that workout totally sucked to, yeah, well, it kind of sucked. So it sucked a little bit less, which that's a win as a coach. And the time to recover improved. So the readiness to train, the level of soreness was relatively high after that first training session. A few weeks later, a very easy modification. Now the readiness to train increased, the time to recover decreased. And that's a great win as a coach because now I can get that client ready for the next intense training session sooner and in a higher readiness state. So think about the energy systems and use the research, use the tools to program your training sessions. One of the worst reasons to do anything is because this is the way I did it, or this is the way that I've always done. So 30 seconds and a minute are nice round numbers, but let's look to the literature and be smarter about some of our programming. I've worked with quite a few half marathoners and full marathoners, a lot of group-based sessions and programs. And again, there's really two approaches. A linear approach, which is represented by that top line to where we are essentially following that 10% rule of a slight increase in training volume from 1 week to the next. The bottom line would be nonlinear, or that load, unload approach, where I'll increase volume for 2 weeks and then back off. In either situation, what we could do with this model is incorporate the field testing that I discussed. So if I want to figure out if my groups, if the people within the group are ready to race, either by their definition or mine, and if they're getting more fit, I'll incorporate a 5K time trial or 10K time trial, maybe at weeks 5 to 8. Once again, at less than race pace intensity. Now, you may look at this figure and say, well, linear is better because we're doing more work. I mean, look at that. We're doing more volume, we're doing more training, and that's going to better prepare somebody to run. But I'm going to ask, what happens about week 6 or 7? I've seen it dozens and dozens of times. Stress accumulates, the combination of life stress and physical stress accumulates, and people get hurt. And when somebody gets hurt, they either drop out of the program or they'll take off 2 weeks and then once again try to catch up, and they have this mindset that they can't miss a training session, so they'll lump them on top of what they're already doing and take 2 weeks and turn it into what should be done in 4 weeks, and again, just adding too much stress. Whereas, the tortoise and the hare type of situation, non-linear, you've got somebody who just keeps chugging along, and actually over the course of those 12 or 13 weeks, will end up missing fewer sessions, and therefore not only getting more volume, but much more importantly, a better quality of training sessions. So what's unique about this as well is that with that load, unload approach, we can somewhat go through the IFT model within the course of a 13-week training program. So for example, maybe the first few weeks in a base training phase, I'm focusing on time on feet. What I mean by that, I'm not concerned at all about running pace. I don't care how fast you go. I don't care how long you go. I want you to jog for 45 minutes today. And that's the plan. And next week, maybe we'll go for 55 minutes. Again, not necessarily following the 10% rule. Going from 50 to 60 minutes would be a 20% increase, for example. So base training phase is maybe more time on feet. And then maybe we're 5K, 10K. Now we are concerned a little bit. We're trying to get some data from feedback on pacing. And then maybe as we get closer, we're tapering. Maybe we're incorporating some higher intensity, shorter duration type of workouts. So again, I can't stress enough how much I love nonlinear or undulating training, and how I think that a direct linear program is relatively antiquated for more than a few weeks. So how do we get that progress? If you have a client who is getting more fit, how do you keep them getting more fit, keep them getting stronger, again, without breaking and adding too much stress? I talked about decreasing rest between sets for interval training and how that's very effective to program and monitor fitness as well. We can increase the duration of the sets. So maybe if they're doing a cycling workout, maybe we have them go 8 minutes per interval rather than 6 minutes. We can do more sets. In base training, maybe we're doing 3 sets of a particular exercise. Maybe in the fitness or performance phase, maybe now we're doing 6 sets. And keep in mind that an endurance session would be 1 set. So increasing duration would be adding minutes, going once again from 45 to 55 or 60 minutes. Higher intensity within each set, so maybe now we're introducing some external load. So we're using a weight vest, maybe using some dumbbells, maybe we're doing more plyometrics, jumping up to a higher box, using an incline on the treadmill. Frequency would be defined as more days per week. And this is a tricky one. This is one that I would do first, and then I would do last. So if you're taking a beginner in the base phase, and they are currently training 2 days a week, getting them to add that 3rd day is not adding too much stress to their system, and that would be a very positive move. But if somebody's already training 4 or 5 days per week, adding another day isn't going to do you any good. I would much rather focus on the quality of those training sessions. Now, an elite athlete probably could handle, at least for a short period of time, an increase from 5 days to 6 days, or if we're counting training sessions, maybe from 10 to 12 training sessions. But again, there's a difference between most of us and elite athletes and their ability to recover. So performance-based training, training tip here for all levels. Training with groups can present a lot of challenges. I've already mentioned time on feet, and I really like that concept because if everybody is running for 50 minutes within the first few weeks of a half marathon training program, they'll all start and finish at the same time. Likewise, for a track-based session, maybe you have different lengths. So the faster runners are maybe running on the outside of the track, and maybe they are doing 400-meter repeats, for example. But those who aren't as fast, maybe they're on the inside and maybe they're running 300 meters. So that way everybody is starting and finishing at the same time. That's better for group cohesiveness. It's better for you as a coach because you're not there for 2 hours. And it's a nicer way so that everyone is getting a good workout for them. So it's a way to apply an individualized approach to large groups. The last suggestion I'll have on this is to use relative intensity terms. So again, rather than programming for a group saying go out for an 8-mile run at an 8 minutes per mile pace, maybe say go out for an 8-mile run at steady state pace, and every 10 minutes run 1 minute at threshold pace. Because that tempo, threshold, steady state, sub-max, however that terminology works, is going to mean something different to everybody. So again, it's the concept of RPE, rating of perceived exertion, and making it individualized for that client. Putting this all together, hitting some summary points. Early on in base training for the ACE IFT model, focus on enjoyment. Create that positive association with physical activity, develop positive habits, get them used to being active. In the fitness phase, now we're progressing intensity, introducing some interval training. The latter stages for performance, now we're getting towards a very specific training goal and considering what they maybe want to compete for. For programming, include flexibility. And I define that as variety without randomness. So we're not tossing in variety just for the sake of doing so. It's very purposeful. Again, it's the iterative mindset, the iterative concept of planning to fail and incorporating enough variety to keep clients engaged, but also keeping enough consistency so that we have results. And then most importantly, the reason they sought you out in the first place and the reason that they didn't just download a program online is because they want something individualized and they want to know what their priorities should be based on their assessment and how to program that and achieve goals. Here's some references that I mentioned, and then that was fun. Went through it pretty fast, so I think we have plenty of time for questions. Really appreciate everybody being engaged with this today, and I'll turn it back over to Jackie.
Thanks, Justin, very much. That was a lot of great information, as you said, and we do have some time for questions. So go ahead and type your question into the questions box right now on your YouTube viewer, and we'll take just a few moments here to go over those questions with our live presenter here in the ACE studio. In the meantime, while you're typing those questions in on your screen, you should be able to see Justin's contact information. So if you would like to follow up with him, follow him, see what he's up to, and ask other questions, you can do so by using the information on the slide. Also, as a reminder, you do have a lot of other opportunities to earn continuing education credits with ACE. If you are interested in this topic, cardiorespiratory training in particular, and the IFT model, there's a lot of great information that ACE has for you. As you can see on your slide, there's some other courses that we have around HIIT training and other cardiorespiratory training programs. So feel free to take a look at those courses if you would like to earn your continuing education credits. Also, as a reminder, you are required to earn 20 hours, that's 2.0 CECs of continuing education credits with your renewal cycle every 2 years to keep your certification current. So if you'd like to do that, one option is to join the ACE CEC Club, and that will allow you to get all the continuing education credits that you need for that renewal cycle and learn a lot about topics like this one. Okay, I think we do have some time for questions, so let's get into those questions right now. And Justin, the first question is around some of the modes of training that you're talking about, right? We've got people that are in the base training phase, maybe they're in the fitness, and then maybe they could be in performance. And, as you said, kind of fluctuating between them depending on their goals and history and all of those things. So are there modes of training that would be recommended or not recommended for any one of those phases? For example, if somebody is in performance, would you ever recommend for them to just walk or vice versa?
Great question. And I think this has to do with what we would call general preparation versus specific preparation. So it would almost look like a cone or funnel, a pyramid, however you want to phrase that, in my opinion, to where when you're in the base training phase, mode is essentially irrelevant because it's about getting people, again, finding their enjoyment, figuring out what they used to do and incorporating something like that. Whereas when you get into a performance base, typically they have a specific goal. I want to do the Mission Trails 5 Peaks Challenge on New Year's Day, and so I need to be able to run a very long distance. So you need to be very specific with your training. So it is very, I would say, phasic like that, to where it becomes less important what mode you are doing as you get towards performance. Now, in terms of an elite athlete, a swimmer, walking, jogging, running, I would say I would tweak that maybe not necessarily by microcycle, so maybe not a recovery-based session, I would do something different, but I would say by season, so maybe by chunks at a time. So yes, it would be very appropriate for an elite athlete to go for a walk or a hike, but not in season. So maybe they're off season, they're coming back towards a base training phase, once again, where it's very wide, multiple types of training, multiple modalities. And then as they get closer to their season, it gets much more specific again and closer to their goal.
Mm-hmm. Great. And as we've talked about in a lot of other IFT model courses, the ACE IFT model is a blueprint for training. So it does allow for those things to be changed for that particular person, for their particular goals. So using the ACE IFT model and walking your client through the different phases throughout their training program allows for some flexibility. So we can provide that to them using the IFT model as a basic kind of foundation to set those things up. So another question that we have live coming in is around the concurrent training that you mentioned. So we had those training tips, the great training tips that we talked about for each of our phases of the cardiorespiratory training model. I think it was the fitness phase that you talked about concurrent training. And let's talk a little bit more about that, because most of the time we would, perhaps all the time, recommend that when somebody is doing cardiorespiratory training, we would also suggest that they are incorporating strength training or muscular training as well. So that goes into that concurrent training that you talked about. Let's hear a little bit more about that and what you would recommend for when somebody is integrating those two parts of the IFT model together.
Great question, and it depends. Just like any good question, the answer to it is it depends. And once again, I would say that it is sort of phasic or that cone shape, to where we're in a base training phase. When I say it depends, what is the client's goal? What is their purpose? What are your intentions with your client? And if they're in a base training phase, they just want to be healthy and fit, then I would say more concurrent training is probably better, because it's introducing different types of modalities, it's introducing different types of stresses to the neuromuscular system and maybe incorporating some agility work. But as you get specific toward a goal, like as the example that I use of a weight power lifter versus an ultra endurance runner, then concurrent training gets much, much less. So yes, it is definitely that triangle shape of more is probably very appropriate at lower fitness levels. But as you get specific to a goal, then concurrent training definitely can influence what you want to try to get out of a training session. So another way to look at it is have a goal, have a purpose for that workout, and don't try to do too many things on one day. Understand that systems in the body need rest. Another pitfall I've seen with marathon runners, I used to work at a physical therapy clinic, and I can't tell you how many times I would sit down and shadow the physical therapist in the introductory session and say, what's going on? Oh, I have back pain. I have knee pain. Well, what do? I like to run. I have a 4-mile loop around my house, and I just do that same loop 5 or 4 times a week. So you're just doing the exact same stress. So early on, when clients are maybe only working out 1 or 3 days a week, absolutely incorporate concurrent training. But understand that when you apply stress, the system needs rest. And so that's why doing different modes on different days for performance or fitness base is probably better to get results.
Great. I think that's a great point about understanding what the goal is for the particular session that you're in. And as Justin talked about earlier in the presentation, you can have those rest days built around those higher intensity days to allow for, if the goal is to be in the higher levels of our energy systems, to make sure that we can reach those goals and have other days built around where maybe we're in the lower energy systems.
Yeah, and every day, you don't have to sweat to get a good workout. You don't have to have sore muscles to get a good workout. And again, I know a lot of athletes have that mentality, and our non-competitive clients have that same mentality, but recovery is so crucial.
Exactly, great point. So last question here that I will pose to our presenter, Justin Robinson, around cardiorespiratory training. The base training phase, as we've talked about, is a great place to help our clients build enjoyment, build good habits when it comes to exercise. So if you have a client that maybe feels, as you just mentioned, Justin, that in order to have a great workout, I have to be super tired and I have to be sweaty and I have to be just dripping in sweat and just tanked after this workout is over, how do we get those clients to understand that being in that base training phase can be a good thing?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And 2 thoughts come to mind. One would be some form of regular reassessment. So the only way to build trust is to show results. So if you test them up front and you never test them again, then you're not giving them that feedback. But if you can do that every other week, incorporate some form of a fitness test, a circumference measurement, maybe something like that, so that you can say, hey, give me 6 weeks. Trust me for these 6 weeks. And if you can show them at regular intervals they're getting better, they will return that trust to you. The other quick one would be, this is Coach Francis from back at San Diego State a few years back. Let them have their dessert, we call it. So if I have a training session where I want you to do not buys and tries and abs because it's maybe not functional to the goal for that day, then I'll spend 90% of the time training that, and then I'll do a quick ab session or a quick arm burnout so that at the very end you can have your dessert from what I thought was the healthy meal leading up to it. So you can maybe still sneak in some of the really sweat stuff, kind of finishers of your workout that's not going to have too much of that negative potential concurrent effect.
Yes, great point. Allowing people to feel like they got what they wanted, but also,
Precisely.
Sticking to your plan and having them make sure that they can reach their goals eventually. So thank you, Justin, very much for all of your input and all of your information today. If you would like to continue the conversation with Justin, we do have the ACE Fitness Facebook page chat up right now, so you can go to our ACE Facebook page and chat in a couple of questions for Justin if you want to continue the conversation there. As a reminder, you watched today for free, so once again, thank you for joining us. If you would like to earn continuing education credits for this course, you will need to purchase the recorded version of this course, and you can do that by following the information on your slide. If you choose to purchase this course, you will also receive 3 training plans that are related to our ACE IFT model in the base, fitness, and performance phase of the model. So you can have access to those 3 PDFs with your course once you purchase on the ACE website. Also, make sure to join us again next week. We have another great live event presented by Shannon Fable, a dear friend of ACE, and she's going to be talking about taking control of your career. So if you have questions about business aspect or want to understand a little bit more information about how you can empower yourself as a fitness and health professional, make sure to join us next week. And also make sure to join us and connect with us on any of our platforms. We like to hear from you. Let us know what you're thinking and what you thought about today's live event. And if you have any questions for ACE, we have a variety of platforms that you can connect with us there. Thank you all for joining us today on this free live event. Now, let's get people moving.